My name is Adelaide Richard, and I am 31 years old. I live in North Carolina, where ancestral family legacies and historic preservation are treated with a reverence bordering on religion. In our tight-knit community, generational wealth means everything. It is symbolized by majestic, centuries-old craftsman bungalows and Victorian-era estates standing proudly along oak-lined streets. But behind those beautiful facades, there is a dark, unspoken rule. Daughters are quietly pressured to step aside and sacrifice their own success so that family assets can be handed over to the favored golden child son. I spent my entire life studying architectural history and preserving our state heritage. I worked my way up to become the Senior Director of Historic Preservation. My older brother Preston, on the other hand, could barely hold down a mid-level management job without our father making a phone call. Yet in my parents' eyes, his mere existence as the son meant he deserved the crown jewel of our family. This past Sunday, my parents sat me down in the formal dining room of our family estate and told me to pack my bags. They announced in front of Preston and his new wife that they were giving the house to him. They said he needed it more because he was building a real future to carry on the Richard family name. My mother looked me right in the eye and told me to be a good sister and step aside. What they did not know was that my grandmother had secretly signed the deed over to me 6 months before she died, and what none of them knew was that as my brother was bragging about tearing out the historic staircase, I was already preparing the legal documents to have him thrown off my property. Before I tell you what happened when the estate lawyer crashed their lavish housewarming party, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Mourning Revenge, but only if this story truly speaks to you. Drop your age and your location in the comments. Here is how one Sunday dinner exposed a lifetime of lies and changed my family forever. It started with the scent of roasted pheasant and old lemon wax. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany dining table inside the 1910 Craftsman estate I had spent my entire life protecting. The intricate wainscoting gleamed under the warm light of the antique crystal chandelier. Outside the heavy oak front doors, the Raleigh evening was humid and thick with the smell of magnolia blossoms. Inside, the air conditioning hummed a low, steady note that barely masked the suffocating tension in the room. As a senior architectural historian, I spent my days fighting to preserve the structural lineage of North Carolina. I analyzed load-bearing walls and documented original stained glass. But in this room, my career was treated like an eccentric little hobby meant to keep me busy until I found a suitable husband. My father, Thomas, sat at the head of the table, adjusting his tailored French cuffs. He held court with the effortless entitlement of a man who believed his surname commanded the tides of local high society. My mother, Caroline, sat at the opposite end, wearing a string of pearls that had belonged to 3 generations of Richard women. Between them sat my brother Preston. He swirled a glass of expensive vintage Bordeaux, holding it by the bowl instead of the stem. His wife Victoria leaned into him, resting her manicured hand lightly on his forearm. She wore a designer dress that cost more than my monthly mortgage and offered practiced, empty smiles every time my father spoke. "Pass the wild rice, Adelaide," my mother said, her tone bright and brittle. I lifted the heavy silver serving bowl and handed it across the table. Preston took it without offering a word of thanks. He heaped a large portion onto his porcelain plate, splashing a drop of dark gravy onto the pristine white lace tablecloth. "So, Adelaide," he said, speaking around a mouthful of food, "are you still fighting over rusty nails and old bricks downtown? I heard the city council rejected your proposal for the warehouse district." "I protect structural integrity, Preston," I replied, keeping my voice level and my eyes locked on his. "It requires a bit more nuance than managing regional truck routes." My father cleared his throat, a sharp, warning sound cutting through the quiet clinking of silverware. "Preston is a logistics director, Adelaide. It is a demanding role that requires actual leadership and vision." My father tapped his crystal water goblet with his silver dessert spoon. The ringing notes silenced the room instantly. Victoria sat up straighter, folding her hands in her lap. My mother offered a tight, rehearsed smile. Caroline and I have made a decision regarding the estate my father began, his voice carrying the exact cadence of a corporate board meeting. He looked at Preston, and a warm paternal pride softened his sharp features. We are looking toward the future of the Richard family legacy. Preston, you and Victoria are ready to start a family. This house requires a patriarch to carry the name forward. We are transferring the deed of this estate to you. Victoria gasped, pressing both hands to her chest in a flawless display of theatrical surprise. Preston puffed out his chest, his posture expanding to fill the space his father had just carved out for him. He raised his wine glass toward the head of the table. "Dad, I do not know what to say," Preston said, his voice thick with unearned triumph. "We will take incredible care of the place. We have already been talking to some luxury contractors. We want to modernize it a bit, tear out that heavy dark staircase and open up the floor plan. Maybe put in a massive glass wall overlooking the garden to bring in some natural light." My fingers tightened around the linen napkin resting in my lap. The rough fabric dug into my palms. Open the floor plan. The phrase hung in the air, a direct physical threat to a legacy of preserved craftsmanship. The staircase he casually wanted to tear out was hand-carved Honduran mahogany sourced over a century ago by our great-grandfather. The very thought of taking a sledgehammer to it made my chest ache. My mother turned her gaze to me. Her eyes were cold, evaluating my reaction, searching for any sign of rebellion. "Adelaide, darling, you will help them pack the antiquities, will you not? It is time to let your brother build his future. We expect you to be happy for him." The expectations settled over the table, heavy and suffocating. Step aside, shrink down. Sacrifice your own history and your own sanctuary so the golden child can tear apart the only thing you truly love. They wanted me to smile while they erased my life work. I looked at my brother. He was already scrolling on his phone, right at the dinner table, probably looking at cheap modern light fixtures to replace the crystal chandelier currently illuminating his smug face. My father watched me, waiting for my obedience. The silence stretched tight enough to snap. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear. I carefully set my silver fork down on the edge of my porcelain plate. The sharp, metallic click was the only sound I made. "Of course, Mother," I said. My tone was smooth, polished, and devoid of friction. "I want Preston to have exactly what he deserves." Preston smirked, leaning back in his chair, mistaking my cold composure for absolute surrender. My father nodded, taking a sip of his wine, satisfied that the natural patriarchal order of his household remained unchallenged. They resumed their dinner, pouring more Bordeaux and discussing demolition timelines and contractor permits. I took a slow sip of my ice water, letting the freezing liquid wash down my throat and ground me in the present moment. Beneath the table, my pulse beat in a steady, calculated rhythm. I stared at the intricate grain of the oak table, mapping the lines of the wood in my mind. Let them plan. Let them measure the historic plaster walls for new drywall. Let them bask in the glow of their hollow victory. What my father and mother did not know, and what my brother could not even fathom as he confidently drank his wine, was that the document they intended to gift did not exist. 6 months ago, my grandmother Estelle sat in a quiet downtown law office and deliberately bypassed their precious family trust. The estate already belonged to me. As I walked out of the house that evening, Preston was already standing in the gravel driveway. The humid North Carolina air clung to my skin, but he looked entirely unfazed, energized by his newly gifted kingdom. He leaned against his leased luxury sedan, holding his phone to his ear. I paused with my hand on my car door, listening to his voice carry through the quiet neighborhood. He was leaving a voicemail for a contractor. He talked loudly about tearing out the original azalea bushes to expand the driveway and pouring cheap concrete over the historic cobblestones. Victoria stood next to him, pointing at the second-floor windows, mapping out her future walk-in closets with wide, sweeping gestures. They were dividing the spoils of a war they did not even know they had lost. I got into my sensible sedan and drove away without saying goodbye, watching them shrink in my rearview mirror. My apartment in downtown Raleigh was a deliberate sanctuary. It featured exposed brick and industrial steel beams, providing a stark aesthetic contrast to the oppressive, suffocating heritage of the family estate. I had purchased it with my own salary earned through years of studying and working my way up the municipal ladder. I locked the deadbolt behind me and walked straight to my bedroom closet. Hidden beneath a stack of archival storage boxes was a heavy steel fireproof safe. I punched in the numeric code and pulled out a thick manila envelope. The paper felt heavy and substantial in my hands. It was the only thing standing between my personal history and my brother wielding a sledgehammer. I sat on the edge of my bed and let my mind drift back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon 6 months ago. The downtown law office of Elias Caldwell smelled of polished leather and aged parchment. Mr. Caldwell had been my grandmother Estelle estate attorney for 4 decades. He was a man who spoke very little and missed absolutely nothing. That afternoon, my grandmother sat across from his heavy oak desk. She was fragile then, her breathing shallow, but her mind remained sharper than cut glass. She wore her signature tweed suit and refused to lean back in the chair, maintaining a rigid posture of pure authority. "My son plays a wealthy man on a stage built by his ancestors," my grandmother said, her voice raspy but firm. She stared out the window, watching the rain streak the glass. "Thomas thinks I am blind to his quiet debts. He assumes I do not see the second mortgages and the maxed-out lines of credit he uses to maintain his country club membership." Mr. Caldwell folded his hands over his legal pad, offering a subtle nod of agreement. "And Preston?" he asked quietly. My grandmother let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Preston is a hollow suit. He could not successfully manage a lemonade stand, let alone a historic property. He views this family lineage as a bank account to be drained. If Thomas hands that house to Preston, he will sell the original fixtures to pay for his golf dues and cover his wife's shopping habits. I will not allow a mediocre man to ruin the foundation my grandfather laid." Mr. Caldwell slid a crisp document across the desk. It was a warranty deed. I sat beside her, watching the legal mechanism that would bypass the probate courts and bypass the family trust Thomas mistakenly thought he controlled. "Once you sign this, Estelle, the property transfers directly to Adelaide upon your passing," Mr. Caldwell explained, his tone clinical and precise. "Thomas will have no legal standing to challenge it. The trust will hold empty air regarding the estate. You understand, this severs your son from the primary asset." "I understand. I am saving my home," she replied. She took the gold fountain pen from the desk and signed her name without a single tremor. Then she turned her head and looked directly at me. "Protect the foundation, Adelaide. Do not let them turn our history into cheap drywall and glass walls. You are the only one who truly sees the value of the timber." I traced her faded blue signature on the true deed resting on my lap in the present day. The ink was dry, but the legal weight was ironclad. Thomas and Caroline had spent their entire Sunday evening acting like benevolent monarchs, handing down a crown they did not even possess. They were so blinded by their own patriarchal traditions that they never stopped to consider my grandmother shared my exact disdain for their superficiality. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling me out of the memory. The screen lit up with a new text message from Preston. I opened the thread. It was a bulleted list of demands typed out with the casual authority of a bad boss assigning weekend chores. He wanted me to drive over on Saturday morning and clear out the East Wing library. That specific room held my grandmother's first edition book collection and hand-carved reading tables dating back to the late 19th century. "Victoria needs the space for her stationary bike and weight racks," he wrote. Have those old dusty books boxed up by noon so the delivery guys can drop off the rubber flooring. My jaw tightened until my teeth actually ached. A home gym. He wanted to throw decades of our grandmother intellectual legacy into cheap cardboard boxes so he could sweat on a rubber mat and look at himself in a mirror. The sheer disrespect radiated from the glowing screen. I stared at the text, feeling a cold, calculating anger settle deep in my chest. He expected me to do the heavy lifting to facilitate his own destruction of the property. I typed a response measuring every single syllable to ensure my tone remained perfectly neutral. "I will handle the library this weekend," I wrote. "You will not have to worry about a thing." It was a promise veiled as blind obedience. I established a pattern of strategic compliance, letting him believe he held the reins. Preston replied seconds later with a simple thumbs-up emoji. He was so incredibly predictable. I set the phone face down and opened my work laptop. Being the senior architectural historian meant I had a direct digital pipeline to the city permitting office. My job required me to review and authorize any structural modifications to properties designated within the Historic Overlay District. As my desktop loaded, an automated municipal alert blinked in my inbox. The subject line read, "Priority level high." I clicked the notification and my blood ran ice cold. Someone had just logged into the portal and filed an expedited building permit application. I read the property address listed on the digital form. It was the family estate. I scrolled down to the applicant name, Preston Richard. He had not just asked for minor cosmetic changes like paint or new kitchen cabinets. The scope of work detailed the immediate removal of load-bearing historic structures. He requested municipal approval to gut the original mahogany staircase, remove the protected stained glass windows in the foyer, and knock down the primary dining room wall to create an open-concept entertainment space. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. He was moving much faster than I had anticipated. The application requested a waiver for the standard 30-day public review period, claiming the interior structures posed a safety hazard. He was lined to the city to fast-track his demolition. The work was scheduled to begin in mere days. If the permit slipped through the automated system before a human reviewed it, he would have the legal cover to start swinging sledgehammers by Wednesday morning. The Raleigh Historic Preservation Commission occupied the second floor of a restored 19th-century municipal building. Sunlight streamed through tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing over rows of slanted drafting tables. The air smelled of aged parchment and bitter black coffee. I sat at my desk at 8 in the morning, logging into the master database long before anyone else arrived. Preston had uploaded his full architectural renderings sometime around midnight. My chest tightened as I scrolled through the attached PDF files. The digital blueprints were a declaration of war. This was not a simple cosmetic update or a gentle modernization. It was a calculated structural butchery. The proposal outlined his explicit intention to strip the craftsman of its heritage overlay designation altogether. He planned to tear out the century-old leaded stained glass windows, replacing them with factory-grade synthetic alternatives. The hand-planed oak flooring, which bore the soft patina of 100 years of footsteps, was slated for removal. In its place, he specified cheap, mass-produced gray laminate. The true motive, however, lay buried on page 14 of the site map. Preston intended to partition the eastern garden. By subdividing the sprawling lot, he could sell off half an acre to a commercial developer to build townhouses. My brother wanted to gut our family history to flip the land for quick cash. The sheer, unadulterated greed radiated from every pixel on my monitor. He viewed the property as a private bank account to fund his extravagant lifestyle. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. A direct confrontation was out of the question. Tipping my hand now would give my father time to hire high-priced litigators to bury me in frivolous injunctions. I needed to operate within the shadows of the bureaucratic machine. My career provided me with an intimate knowledge of municipal friction. I opened the structural assessment tab on his application, searching for a flaw. I found it within 10 minutes. Preston had hired a budget surveyor who failed to map the subterranean root system of the heritage oak trees lining the western driveway. According to Municipal Code Section 4.2, any excavation within 50 feet of a protected root system required a specialized environmental arborist review. It was a minor, obscure loophole, but it possessed ironclad legal weight. I clicked a single digital box flagging the omission. The system generated an automated freeze order on the entire permit. The application would bounce back to Preston as a generic administrative error, effectively shielding my personal involvement. The automated hold would require a new survey, dragging the process out for at least 3 weeks. I logged out of the portal satisfied. The paper shield was in place. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, letting out a long breath. I assumed the denial would force him to pause and reassess his strategy. I severely underestimated his profound impatience and his toxic arrogance. By Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting in a dull zoning committee meeting, listening to a developer argue over historic brick colors. My cell phone vibrated sharply against the long wooden conference table. The screen displayed a call from Aunt Valerie. She was my mother's sister and my sharpest, most pragmatic ally. Valerie was a brilliant African-American woman who had married into the maternal side of our family decades ago. She possessed a ruthless understanding of the toxic pretensions rotting the Richard family tree. Valerie never hesitated to call out my father when his behavior crossed the line, and she always treated my career with genuine respect, recognizing the value of hard work over unearned privilege. Valerie lived just 3 blocks away from the estate. She walked her golden retriever past our wrought iron gates every single afternoon like clockwork. I excused myself from the committee meeting and stepped out into the quiet marble hallway to answer the call. "Adelaide, you need to get over here right now," Valerie said. Her voice lacked its usual smooth composure. It was tight with genuine urgency. "What is happening?" I asked, pressing the phone hard against my ear. "Your brother has lost his mind," Valerie replied. "There are 2 unmarked white cargo vans parked on the front lawn. 6 men in dirty tank tops are unloading heavy equipment. They do not have city contractor badges on their shirts. Preston is standing on the front steps, pointing at the wraparound porch, giving them orders like a dictator." My breath caught in my throat. The wraparound porch featured custom spindle work crafted by a renowned local artisan in 1912. The joints were secured with wooden pegs instead of modern nails. It was a priceless piece of our state architectural fabric. I had spent countless summer evenings sitting on those very steps, reading books, while my grandmother tended to the garden. One of the men just swung a sledgehammer into the corner balustrade. Valerie continued, her tone dropping into a fierce whisper. "I heard the old woods splinter from the street. They are tearing it apart, Adelaide, right this second. He is treating a historical landmark like a cheap teardown project." Preston did not wait for the permit approval. He assumed his surname granted him immunity from municipal regulations. When the automated system blocked his application, he must have panicked and hired a cheap, unlicensed crew to begin the demolition under the radar. He thought he could destroy the historic features before the city even noticed, asking for forgiveness instead of permission. He wanted to present the destruction as a done deal, forcing everyone to accept his new reality. Valerie described the debris falling onto the manicured grass, but her words faded into a low hum in my ears. A fierce protective adrenaline surged through my veins, pushing aside any lingering hesitation. "I am on my way," I told her, my voice steady, despite the anger boiling inside me. "Do not let them see you watching. Stay safe, Valerie." I ended the call and sprinted back into my office. I ignored the questioning looks from my colleagues seated around the drafting tables. I grabbed my car keys from the desk drawer and unclipped my heavy brass senior director badge from its lanyard, sliding it into my tailored jacket pocket. I grabbed a stack of official cease and desist forms, ensuring I had the correct paperwork to back up my authority. The drive across the city felt agonizingly slow. I gripped the leather steering wheel, weaving through the sluggish midday traffic. My mind raced through local enforcement protocols, calculating the exact fines and penalties I could leverage against an unpermitted demolition. The conflict was no longer confined to digital files, text messages, and quiet, tense dinners. The war had moved on to the physical battlefield of my childhood home. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, ignoring the speed limit as I merged onto the historic District Parkway. I could picture my brother standing on that lawn, smug and entitled, destroying the legacy my grandmother entrusted to me. I promised her I would protect the foundation. I intended to keep that promise. The estate gates were only 2 miles away, and I was bringing the full weight of the law with me. I slammed my car into park, right on the pristine front lawn of the estate. Dust plumed around the tires, coating the freshly planted manicured flower beds. The sound of raw destruction echoed across the quiet neighborhood. An unlicensed worker in a stained gray tank top stood on the wraparound porch, raising a heavy sledgehammer. He swung the iron head directly into a century-old balustrade. The hand-carved wood splintered with a sickening crack. "Stop right there!" I shouted, stepping out of the vehicle. The worker paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked past me toward the front door. Preston stood on the threshold, wearing a crisp polo shirt and designer sunglasses. He held a clipboard, pretending to supervise a job he knew nothing about. "Keep working," Preston ordered, waving his hand dismissively. "She is just my sister. She does not know what she is talking about." I reached into my tailored jacket pocket and pulled out my heavy brass municipal shield. I held it up high, catching the afternoon sunlight. "I am the Senior Director of the Historic Preservation Commission," I announced, my voice projecting across the yard, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "This is an official municipal order. Drop your tools and step away from the structure immediately." The foreman, a burly man covered in drywall dust, stepped forward. He looked at my badge and then glanced nervously at Preston. "You told us the permits were cleared, man," the foreman said, lowering his crowbar. "We do not mess with city violations. Those fines will bankrupt my crew." Preston marched down the wooden steps, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "Put that ridiculous piece of metal away, Adelaide. You are embarrassing yourself. This is my property. I can do whatever I want with it." "You do not have a single approved permit on file, Preston," I replied, staring him down. "I checked the portal this morning. If your men strike that porch one more time, I will have the police here in 3 minutes to arrest you for unauthorized demolition of a heritage site. I am holding the official cease and desist form right now." I pulled the crisp white document from my folder and handed it to the foreman. The contractor took one look at the municipal seal, turned around, and whistled to his crew. They dropped their tools and began loading their trucks without another word. Preston stood on the ruined porch, humiliated in front of the very men he hired to assert his dominance. His jaw worked furiously. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his fingers jabbing the screen. He did not call his wife or his lawyer. He called our father. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was a short text from Thomas demanding my presence at the Oakmont Country Club. The club was a sprawling Georgian brick building surrounded by 18 holes of pristine golf greens. It was the epicenter of old money in Raleigh. My father spent half his life in those leather-upholstered rooms, leveraging his surname to broker deals and intimidate his rivals. He chose this specific location to remind me of the power dynamics. I was merely a guest in his world. I walked into the private lounge. The room smelled of expensive cigar smoke and single malt bourbon. Thomas sat in a high-backed leather armchair, occupying a secluded corner booth. He did not stand when I approached. He simply pointed to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, Adelaide," he commanded softly. I slid into the seat, keeping my posture rigid. I folded my hands in my lap, waiting for the storm. "Your brother called me Thomas," began swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He was quite upset. You cost him a significant amount of money today, sending those contractors away. You humiliated him in public. I was doing my job, I answered, maintaining a cool, even tone. He attempted to execute an illegal demolition. The city would have caught him eventually. I actually saved him from a huge legal headache. Do not play semantics with me, Thomas snapped, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. This is not about building codes or your little preservation hobby. This is about your hysterical jealousy. You cannot stand the fact that Preston is building a real future while you play museum curator. You are acting out like a spoiled child, throwing a tantrum because you did not get the toy you wanted. I bit the inside of my cheek, using the sharp sting of pain to keep my expression blank. He truly believed I was acting out of petty sibling rivalry. We are putting an end to this today. Thomas continued reaching inside his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of thick legal paper and slid it across the polished mahogany table. I looked down. The document was a formally drafted quitclaim deed. The Richard Family Trust is extensive, Thomas said, leaning forward. You have always enjoyed the financial security it provides, but I will not allow you to sabotage your brother out of spite. You will sign this document right now. It explicitly surrenders any perceived rights or claims you might think you have regarding the ancestral estate. If you refuse, I will contact the trust administrators tomorrow morning. I will have you disinherited from the broader family funds before lunch. The sheer audacity of the threat hung in the smoky air. He was attempting to weaponize his wealth to force my obedience. I picked up the document, reading the dense legal paragraphs. The words danced on the page, revealing a profound irony that almost made me laugh out loud. Thomas was threatening to cut me off unless I signed away a house he did not realize I already owned outright. He was demanding a signature that would hold zero legal weight because the family trust possessed no actual claim to the property. My grandmother Estelle had foreseen this exact moment. She knew Thomas would use his financial leverage to bully me into submission. I let my hands tremble just slightly, playing the role of the intimidated daughter. I lowered my gaze, adopting a facade of wounded obedience. I knew that if I laughed in his face, he would realize something was wrong. He might investigate the county property records and discover the true deed before I was ready to spring the trap. I needed him to feel victorious. "Dad, this is a lot to process," I whispered, letting a fake tremor enter my voice. "You are asking me to sign away my childhood home under the threat of losing my entire safety net." "I am asking you to be rational, Adelaide," he replied, his tone softening just a fraction now that he believed he had won. "Preston needs the house, you do not. Sign the paper and we can put this ugly jealousy behind us. We can go back to being a happy family." I traced the signature line with my index finger. "I cannot sign this without having my own lawyer read it first," I said, looking up at him with wide, vulnerable eyes. "It is standard legal procedure. You taught me to never sign a contract without a review. I will take it to a firm downtown tomorrow morning. If everything is standard, I will sign it." Thomas studied my face, searching for any hint of deception. My mask remained flawless. He took a sip of his bourbon, a smug, satisfied smile spreading across his face. He believed he had successfully crushed my rebellion. "Fine," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Take 24 hours, but bring it to Sunday dinner, signed and notarized. Do not test my patience again, Adelaide." I folded the fraudulent quitclaim deed and placed it carefully into my purse. I stood up from the leather chair, offering him a quiet, polite nod. I walked out of the country club, keeping my pace measured and slow until I reached the privacy of my car. Once inside, I locked the doors and dropped the facade. The wounded, obedient daughter vanished, replaced by the architect of his impending downfall. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and opened a new message to Elias Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell." I typed, my thumbs flying across the digital keyboard. My father just tried to force me to sign a fake quitclaim deed under threat of disinheritance. Preston attempted an unpermitted demolition today. They are escalating faster than we predicted. Please prepare the true deed and draft the necessary legal notices. We are going to war. I hit send and started the engine. The motor roared to life, a low, powerful rumble that mirrored the fierce determination settling into my bones. Thomas thought he had just issued a checkmate. He had no idea he was playing on a board I already owned. The drive to Asheville took 2 hours, winding through the blue ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. The scenery usually calmed my mind, but today the dense green forests blurred past my windows unrecognized. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel, holding the tension from my encounter at the country club. I navigated the narrow, historic streets of downtown Asheville until I found the address Aunt Valerie had texted me earlier that morning. The restaurant was a quiet, upscale bistro tucked away from the main tourist thoroughfares. It smelled of roasted garlic and expensive truffle oil. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers, providing a layer of acoustic privacy for the patrons. I spotted Valerie sitting at a secluded corner booth. She wore a tailored emerald silk blouse and a vintage gold necklace that caught the dim restaurant lighting. Valerie possessed an intimidating grace and a razor-sharp intellect. As a woman who had navigated the treacherous social waters of the Richard family for decades, she understood their toxic pretenses better than anyone. She saw right through my father and his grand illusions of nobility. I slid into the plush velvet booth across from her. She did not offer a warm greeting or ask about the drive. She simply took a sip of her sparkling water and locked her dark, piercing eyes onto mine. "You look like a woman who just stared down a firing squad," Valerie observed, her voice low and measured. "Thomas gave me an ultimatum," I replied, keeping my tone equally hushed. "He handed me a fraudulent quitclaim deed. He threatened to disinherit me from the broader family trust if I do not sign away my rights to the estate by Sunday dinner. He thinks I am throwing a jealous tantrum over Preston getting the house." Valerie placed her water glass down on the crisp white linen tablecloth. A cold, knowing smile touched the corners of her mouth. She reached into her designer leather handbag and pulled out a small silver flash drive. She placed it next to the salt shaker and slid it slowly across the table until it rested directly in front of me. "Your father does not care about sibling jealousy, Adelaide," Valerie said, leaning forward. "And he certainly does not care about passing the torch to your brother. The grand patriarchal narrative is a convenient lie. The real truth is sitting right there on that drive." I looked down at the small piece of metal. "What is this?" I asked, feeling a sudden chill radiate through my chest. "It is a complete ledger of your father's private commercial real estate holdings," Valerie explained. "I have a contact at a prominent accounting firm in Charlotte. They handle the shadow books for several prominent families. Thomas has been quietly drowning in toxic commercial debt for the past 5 years. He leveraged his primary investments into a series of luxury strip malls right before the retail market collapsed. He owes millions to private lenders who do not offer grace periods or polite extensions." I stared at her, struggling to process the magnitude of the revelation. Thomas always projected an image of invincible wealth. The country club memberships, the bespoke suits, the vintage wine collection, they were all carefully constructed facades, hiding a crumbling financial foundation. If he is bankrupt, why is he giving the most valuable remaining asset to Preston? I asked, tracing the edge of the flash drive with my index finger. Why not sell the estate himself to clear the debt? Because selling the ancestral home would be a public admission of failure, Valerie countered. It would destroy his reputation among the Raleigh elite. He needs cash, but he also needs to maintain his status. That is where your foolish brother enters the equation. Valerie signaled the waiter with a subtle nod, ordering 2 black coffees before turning her intense focus back to me. "Thomas is gifting the house to Preston, so your brother can act as a clean proxy." Valerie continued breaking down the conspiracy with clinical precision. "Preston has fresh credit and no existing commercial debt. As soon as the title is supposedly in his name, Preston is going to leverage the deep equity of the historic property to secure a high-risk shadow loan from an unregulated private equity firm. The money will quietly funnel back to Thomas to pay off his commercial lenders, saving him from public ruin. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. The situation was no longer a simple case of archaic sexism or unfair favoritism. It was a calculated financial exploitation. They were conspiring to hollow out my grandmother's cherished home, stealing the equity to cover my father's reckless gambling. And they expected me to step aside and smile while they robbed me blind. Preston gets to play the wealthy lord of the manor, spending a fraction of the loan on his tacky modern renovations. Valerie added, her voice dripping with disgust. Thomas gets a secret bailout, and you get pushed out into the cold, left with nothing but a fake inheritance that Thomas can hold over your head forever. They plan to drain the property dry and leave you holding an empty bag. I picked up the silver flash drive, clutching it tightly in my palm. The metal dug into my skin, grounding me in the harsh reality of their deception. Every memory I had of my father lecturing me about responsibility and legacy dissolved into ash. I have to stop him, I whispered, my voice trembling with a potent mixture of grief and pure rage. I need to take the true deed to the bank tomorrow. I will show the private equity firm that Preston does not own the collateral. I can block the loan before he signs anything. Valerie reached across the table and placed her warm hand over mine, stopping me instantly. No, Valerie commanded, her grip firm and unyielding. You will do nothing of the sort, Adelaide. If you stop them right now, Thomas will spin a new lie. He will claim it was all a misunderstanding. He will find another way to obscure his fraud and protect his golden boy. You have to let them walk right into the trap they built for themselves. I looked at her, searching for the strategy hidden behind her dark eyes. But if Preston signs that loan agreement, he is collateralizing a house he does not own, I argued. Exactly, Valerie said, a sharp, victorious light illuminating her expression. Right now, he is just an arrogant, entitled brat, swinging a sledgehammer on a porch. But the moment he signs his name to those financial documents, claiming ownership of an asset he does not possess, he crosses a very dangerous line. It elevates his actions from simple familial greed to federal bank fraud. Let him dig his grave deeper, Adelaide. Let him secure the funding. Let him commit the crime. The waiter arrived, placing 2 steaming cups of dark coffee on the table. The rich aroma filled the space between us. I released my breath, feeling a new, profound clarity settle over my mind. Valerie was right. Stopping them now would only result in a messy family argument. Allowing them to execute their fraudulent scheme would hand me the power to destroy them legally, professionally, and permanently. I will wait, I said, dropping the flash drive into my purse next to the fake quit-claim deed. I will let Preston believe he is winning. Good, Valerie replied, taking a slow sip of her coffee. But watch your back closely. Preston is impatient. Your stop work order humiliated him today. He will not sit quietly and wait for the permitting office to review his application. He is going to try to bypass your authority entirely. My phone vibrated in my jacket pocket, interrupting our conversation. I pulled it out and read the incoming text message from one of my junior clerks at the Historic Preservation Commission. The words on the screen confirmed Valerie's prediction with terrifying accuracy. Preston had just petitioned the City Council for an emergency public hearing. He was attempting to override my departmental authority, banking on the Richard family name to force the demolition through political channels. The battlefield was shifting from the quiet shadows of backroom finance to the glaring spotlight of a municipal showdown. He wanted a public fight, and I was going to give him one he would never forget. The Raleigh City Council chambers occupied a grand rotunda filled with carved mahogany pews and echoing acoustics. It was a space designed to make ordinary citizens feel small and to make men like my father feel entirely at home. I walked down the center aisle, keeping my gaze fixed firmly on the elevated dais where the 7 council members sat. The room hummed with the low murmur of local politicians and aggressive developers negotiating zoning borders. Preston stood near the front row, leaning casually against the wooden railing. He wore a sharp navy suit and a charismatic grin, shaking hands with the district representatives. He was in his element, relying on the superficial charm our father taught him to navigate municipal hurdles. He believed this hearing was a mere formality. He thought his surname was a master key that could unlock any door in this city. The council president struck his heavy wooden gavel, calling the session to order. He announced the emergency petition filed by the Richard family regarding the heritage property on Elm Street. Preston strode confidently toward the central podium, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease. "Thank you, esteemed members of the council," Preston began, his voice projecting smooth and clear across the rotunda. "As a representative of the Richard family, I stand before you tonight to advocate for progress. My father Thomas and I believe in honoring our city history, but we also recognize the vital need for modernization. The current regulatory hold placed on our private estate by the Historic Preservation Commission is a textbook example of extreme bureaucratic overreach." He paused, scanning the dais, to ensure he held their attention. He deployed his corporate logistics jargon, hoping to dazzle them with empty buzzwords. "We are proposing an adaptive reuse strategy," Preston continued, gesturing fluidly with his hands. "We want to update a decaying structure to meet contemporary safety standards. The Commission is blocking us over a few old floorboards and a crumbling porch. We are asking this governing body to override the stop work order so we can revitalize our property and contribute to the economic growth of this beautiful district. We simply want the freedom to manage our own asset without facing endless red tape from overzealous municipal employees." He smiled warmly, stepping back from the podium, expecting a round of applause. A few council members nodded sympathetically, swayed by his confident delivery and the heavy implication of his political connections. The council president turned his attention toward the rear of the room. "We will now hear the official response from the senior architectural historian," he stated. I stood up from my seat and walked down the aisle. My tailored gray blazer felt like a suit of armor. I carried a thick leather binder containing 50 pages of forensic architectural data. I did not spare my brother a single glance as I passed him. I stepped up to the podium and placed my binder on the wooden surface. I connected my digital tablet to the main projector, casting the original property blueprints onto the massive screen behind the dais. "Good evening, council members," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. "The petitioner claims this department is obstructing progress over trivial details. Allow me to clarify the exact nature of the proposed demolition." I tapped my screen, switching the slide to display the modern floor plan he submitted. I did not refer to him by his name or acknowledge our familial bond. In this room, he was simply a delinquent developer attempting to ruin a protected landmark. "The petitioner intends to remove the central load-bearing wall located in the primary dining corridor," I stated, pointing a red laser at the projected diagram. According to the structural engineering schematics submitted in his expedited application, he plans to replace this essential support barrier with a decorative steel beam. However, the proposed beam lacks the required tensile strength to support the second-story masonry. If this council overrides the stop work order and permits this specific alteration, the roofline will suffer catastrophic failure within 5 years. A low murmur rippled through the audience. Several council members leaned forward, scrutinizing the projected blueprints with sudden, intense concern. Furthermore, I continued switching the slide to a detailed photograph of the damaged wraparound porch. The petitioner hired an unlicensed contracting crew to illegally dismantle a handcrafted balustrade constructed in 1912. The joints of this porch utilize historical wooden pegs, not modern metal fasteners. The petitioner intends to replace this priceless craftsmanship with cheap synthetic composite materials sourced from a discount commercial supplier. This is not adaptive reuse. This is the calculated destruction of a designated heritage asset to minimize costs for a rapid property flip. Preston shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His charismatic smile dissolved into a rigid grimace. He crossed his arms tightly across his chest, glaring at the back of my head. I closed my leather binder with a sharp, definitive snap. The Historic Preservation Commission firmly recommends that this council deny the appeal. We also formally request that the petitioner be held financially accountable for the unauthorized structural damage inflicted upon the porch prior to the issuance of the cease and desist mandate. Thank you for your time. I stepped away from the podium, returning to my seat in the gallery. The silence in the rotunda was absolute. The council members whispered among themselves, passing my printed reports down the elevated desk. They possessed a deep reverence for the Richard family wealth, but they feared public liability even more. Approving a structurally unsound demolition that could collapse a historic roof was political suicide. The council president adjusted his microphone. His expression was stern and unforgiving. The evidence presented by the senior director is comprehensive and deeply troubling, he announced, his voice echoing through the silent room. This council unanimously denies the petition to override the current stop work order. Furthermore, we are issuing an immediate citation for the unpermitted demolition. The applicant is hereby ordered to pay a municipal fine of $35,000 for the willful destruction of a protected heritage feature. Payment is due within 7 business days. This session is adjourned. He struck the gavel, ending the debate permanently. I walked out of the chambers, breathing in the cool night air. The municipal parking lot was bathed in the harsh yellow glow of sodium streetlights. I unlocked my sedan, but before I could open the door, heavy footsteps crunched rapidly across the asphalt behind me. "You think you are so incredibly clever," Preston snarled, his voice vibrating with raw malice. I turned around slowly, leaning back against my car. He stood inches away from me. The charming facade he wore inside the council rotunda had burned away, revealing the entitled, furious tyrant lurking underneath. His face was flushed red, and his fists were clenched tightly at his sides. "You just cost me $35,000, he hissed, stepping closer, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. "You embarrassed me in front of the entire zoning board. You went out of your way to humiliate your own blood, just because you are bitter and alone." I looked up at him, my expression remaining perfectly serene. "I simply provided the council with accurate structural data," I replied softly. "If you cannot afford the fines, perhaps you should avoid committing municipal violations." Preston let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You are enjoying this little power trip, Adelaide, but it ends this weekend. You can throw all the red tape and building codes at me you want. It changes nothing." He leaned down, bringing his face level with mine. His breath smelled of stale coffee and blind, arrogant fury. "Dad is hosting the grand housewarming party this Saturday evening," Preston sneered, his eyes gleaming with toxic triumph. "Every important family in Raleigh will be there. The caterers are booked, and the champagne is on ice. We are signing the formal deed transfer right in the middle of the grand foyer. The estate will legally belong to me in exactly 4 days. Once my name is on that title, I will hire a new army of lawyers to dissolve your pathetic historic overlay. I am going to tear that old mahogany staircase apart with my own bare hands, just to watch you cry." He stepped back, straightening his expensive suit jacket. "Pack your bags, little sister. You are officially out of time." He turned around and marched toward his luxury vehicle, believing he had delivered the ultimate devastating final blow. I stood alone under the flickering yellow streetlight. I did not tremble. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or defeat. Instead, I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The tension coiled tighter inside my chest, a powerful kinetic energy preparing to strike. Preston was so consumed by his own petty vengeance, he failed to realize he was racing headfirst into a federal trap. He was about to host a massive public celebration to sign a fraudulent document. He was going to collateralize a shadow loan using an asset he did not possess. I opened my car door and slid into the driver's seat. I had to monitor the public county records very closely over the next 48 hours. Preston was hemorrhaging cash to pay off his fines, and his unlicensed contractors were undoubtedly demanding their unearned wages. He was being pushed into a desperate financial corner, and desperate men always made fatal mistakes. Wednesday morning brought a deceptive calm to the historic district. The air felt crisp, carrying the scent of damp pine needles and distant rain. I sat at my desk inside the Preservation Commission, nursing a cup of black coffee, while the rest of the city slowly woke up. My dual monitors cast a pale blue glow across my face. I was logged into the Wake County Register of Deeds portal, refreshing the digital records every 15 minutes. I knew my brother very well. I understood the fragile architecture of his ego. The crushing financial penalty levied by the city council would force him to scramble for liquid cash. He owed $35,000 to the municipality. He also carried the impending burden of caterers, event planners, and florists for his upcoming lavish Saturday gala. His bank accounts were undoubtedly stretched thin while he waited for the illicit shadow loan to clear. I anticipated he would cut corners to survive the week. I expected him to default on his most vulnerable creditor. At 9:15, a new document populated the county database attached to the address of our ancestral home. I clicked the linked file, my heart beating a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. It was a formal notice of intent to file a mechanic lien. The claimant was the unlicensed foreman from the botched porch demolition. Preston had refused to pay the crew for their abbreviated labor, claiming their failure to finish the job voided their verbal agreement. The foreman retaliated by initiating a legal claim against the property title itself. A mechanic lien presented a unique tactical opportunity. If the claim became official, it would cloud the title and potentially alert the private equity firm before Preston finalized his fraudulent loan. I needed Preston to secure that funding to elevate his crime to a federal level. I could not let a petty contractor dispute derail the larger trap. Furthermore, purchasing the liability would grant me a profound strategic advantage. I printed the notice, grabbed my purse, and drove to a gritty diner on the outskirts of town, where the contractor listed his business address. The establishment smelled of stale frying oil and burnt toast. A flickering neon sign buzzed in the window, casting a red hue over the cracked vinyl booths. The foreman sat in a corner, nursing a mug of coffee. He looked up, wary and defensive, as I slid into the seat directly across from him. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I withdrew a certified cashier check drawn directly from my personal savings account. I placed it face down on the sticky table. "I am here to settle my brother's outstanding invoice," I stated, my voice flat and businesslike. "I will cover the exact amount he owes your crew for the labor performed on the estate yesterday. In exchange, you will sign a legal assignment of debt, transferring the creditor rights entirely to me. You get paid today, and you drop the lien intent immediately." The burly man eyed me suspiciously before flipping the check over. He saw the printed numbers, and a slow, relieved breath escaped his lips. He pulled a crumpled invoice from his pocket and signed the transfer authorization without a single argument. I slid the signed paper into my briefcase. I walked out of the diner possessing a lethal new weapon. I was no longer just the rightful owner of the estate. I was officially the primary financial creditor, holding a legally binding obligation over the head of my brother. I drove back toward the city center, letting the rhythm of the highway soothe my mind. My phone connected to the car Bluetooth system. A notification chimed, indicating a new voicemail from my mother. I pressed play, letting Caroline's voice fill the quiet cabin. Her tone dripped with a toxic saccharine sweetness designed to manipulate and disarm. "Adelaide, darling," her voice cooed through the speakers, sounding breathless and artificially fragile. "Your father and I are very disappointed in your behavior at the council meeting last night. You are making things so incredibly difficult for everyone. Preston is under a tremendous amount of stress trying to prepare the house for his future family. He mentioned you caused some trouble with his workers. We need you to be the bigger person here. You make a very comfortable salary sitting in that government office all day. We think it would be a beautiful gesture of sibling loyalty if you contributed some of your savings to help fund his renovations. It is time to grow up and support your family, Adelaide. Call me back so we can discuss your financial contribution." The recording ended, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the car. I gripped the leather steering wheel, feeling the familiar sting of her psychological warfare. She was attempting to gaslight me into financing my own destruction. She wanted me to hand over my hard-earned salary to subsidize the demolition of my beloved childhood home. The sheer entitlement was breathtaking. It highlighted the deep systemic rot infecting our family dynamic. They viewed my success not as an achievement to celebrate, but as a resource to be harvested for the benefit of the golden child. I did not shed a tear. I did not yell. I simply deleted the message, erasing her poisonous voice from my sanctuary. Evening shadows stretched long across the wet pavement by the time I arrived at the downtown law office. Mr. Caldwell waited for me, his desk illuminated by a single brass reading lamp. The room smelled of old paper and quiet authority. We spent the next 3 hours drafting the final lethal documentation required for the upcoming weekend. We organized the true warranty deed, proving my exclusive ownership since my grandmother passed. We attached the newly acquired assignment of debt, proving Preston owed me thousands of dollars. We finalized the formal eviction notices and the trespassing citations. Mr. Caldwell reviewed every syllable, ensuring the legal net contained 0 weak points. We placed the stack of documents into a thick ceremonial folder, matching the exact dimensions of the one my father planned to use at the party. The paper felt heavy and substantial. The trap was set. Flawless and unforgiving. As I sat in the leather chair sipping a cup of chamomile tea, my thoughts drifted across town. In a sleek, glass-walled high-rise in the financial district, Preston sat across from a private equity lender. I pictured him wearing his tailored suit, flashing that confident, unearned smile. He held a silver pen, hovering over a master promissory note. He believed he was outsmarting everyone. He believed he was securing a fortune to save our father and elevate his own status in society. He pressed the pen to the paper, tracing his signature onto the binding contract. He finalized the shadow loan, fully collateralizing a historic estate he had 0 legal claim to. The snare pulled tight, locking him into a federal crime. Thursday arrived with a heavy, humid heat that settled over the Raleigh Historic District like a wool blanket. I sat in my office, reviewing a fresh batch of zoning appeals, when a peculiar email filtered into my departmental inbox. It was a standard municipal notification, triggered whenever a licensed real estate professional requested copies of archival property blueprints. The applicant was a private appraiser named Gregory Gable. His firm had a notorious reputation in the commercial real estate sector. Gable was the man you hired when you needed numbers to tell a very specific creative story. My father was attempting one final desperate maneuver before the weekend. Gifting a heritage estate required formal tax documentation, and securing a shadow loan demanded a certified valuation. A legitimate appraisal of our century-old craftsman would trigger a staggering gift tax liability and expose the extreme risk of Preston unearned equity. Thomas needed the property to appear distressed. He needed Gable to drastically undervalue the home on paper, ensuring the fraudulent transfer seemed like a financial burden rather than a windfall. I picked up my desk phone and dialed a number I rarely used. It belonged to the state-level historical auditing board in the Capitol. The woman who answered was Director Evelyn Thorne. Evelyn was a terrifyingly precise bureaucrat who possessed zero tolerance for property fraud. She treated North Carolina architectural history with a fierce, protective reverence. I explained the situation, detailing my suspicion that a corrupt appraiser was about to falsify structural data on a protected landmark. Evelyn did not hesitate. We coordinated a simultaneous inspection. Gable scheduled his walkthrough for 2 o'clock that afternoon. Evelyn promised to arrive at exactly 2:15. I drove to the estate parking down the street, concealed beneath the shade of a weeping willow. I rolled my windows down, letting the thick afternoon air fill the cabin. Through the wrought iron gates, I watched Gregory Gable pace along the brick foundation of my childhood home. He wore a cheap, rumpled suit and carried a digital tablet. He did not bother utilizing a moisture meter or a structural level. He simply tapped the pristine brickwork with the toe of his leather shoe, typing rapidly onto his screen. He was drafting a fiction designed to save my father from bankruptcy. 15 minutes later, a sleek silver government vehicle pulled into the driveway. Evelyn Thorne stepped out holding a metal briefcase. She wore a sharp charcoal blazer and a severe expression. I stepped out of my car and followed her up the gravel path, maintaining a calculated silence. Gable looked up from his tablet, his face paling as he recognized the official state seal embossed on Evelyn's briefcase. "Good afternoon, Mr. Gable," Evelyn said, her voice crisp and cutting. The State Auditing Board received a priority alert regarding the structural integrity of this heritage site. Since you are currently conducting an appraisal, we will verify your preliminary findings in real time. Gable swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously. "This is just a routine walkthrough, Director Thorne. The owner requested a private valuation. The foundation shows extensive subterranean rot and severe water damage along the eastern load-bearing walls. I am forced to downgrade the property value significantly. It is practically a teardown." Evelyn set her briefcase on the hood of his sedan. She snapped the latches open, revealing a sophisticated array of diagnostic equipment. She pulled out a thermal imaging scanner and a sonic moisture detector. "Fascinating," Evelyn replied, handing me the thermal scanner. "Adelaide, please scan the eastern brickwork. Let us document this severe water damage for the permanent state record." I pointed the device at the foundation, the screen displaying a solid, uniform spectrum indicating perfectly dry, structurally sound masonry. I held the monitor up so Gable could see the undeniable empirical truth. "Zero moisture detected," I stated, my tone clinical and detached. "The brickwork is pristine. The mortar joints were repointed 3 years ago by a master mason." Evelyn picked up her clipboard, clicking her pen. "Mr. Gable, falsifying structural decay on a protected historical landmark is a severe violation of the state appraisal code. It constitutes deliberate financial fraud. I am opening an immediate formal inquiry into your licensing credentials. I will also be confiscating your tablet as evidence of your preliminary draft." Panic seized the corrupt appraiser. He looked at the flawless foundation and then at the uncompromising glare of the state director. He knew his career was evaporating before his eyes. He did not attempt to argue or defend my father's grand scheme. He simply dropped his tablet onto the grass, scrambled into his car, and sped down the driveway, his tires squealing against the asphalt. He fled the scene, terrified of losing his livelihood, leaving Thomas entirely exposed. Evelyn picked up the discarded device, sealing it inside an evidence bag. She offered me a curt nod of professional respect before returning to her vehicle. The bureaucratic warfare was swift and devastating. I stood on the lawn, watching the dust settle. My cell phone vibrated. I ignored the call, but I knew exactly what was happening inside the Oakmont Country Club. Thomas was scrambling. His corrupt appraiser had abandoned him, and the required valuation documents were now trapped in state custody. Without a distressed appraisal, the gift tax would be astronomical. Despite this catastrophic failure, Preston pushed forward. His ego blinded him to the crumbling foundation of their conspiracy. He was too impatient and too desperate for the shadow loan money to clear. He convinced himself the appraisal was merely a technicality that his expensive private equity lenders would overlook once his signature was on the dotted line. He refused to cancel his grand moment of triumph. Friday arrived, bringing a flurry of frantic activity to the estate. I drove past the property on my way home from the commission office. A fleet of white delivery trucks clogged the oak-lined street. Men in matching polo shirts unloaded massive white canvas tents, erecting them across the sprawling green lawns. Florists carried elaborate arrangements of imported white roses and orchids up the mahogany steps. Caterers rolled stainless steel warming carts into the side entrance, preparing to feed half the socialites in the county. Preston was orchestrating his own coronation. He paced the grounds, barking orders at the event staff, acting like the undisputed lord of the manor. He was spending money he did not possess, celebrating a victory that only existed in his own deluded mind. I returned to my downtown apartment, leaving the chaos behind. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across my exposed brick walls. I walked into my bedroom and opened the heavy oak wardrobe. The upcoming Saturday gala required a very specific uniform. I bypassed the flowing evening gowns and delicate silk dresses. I needed something sharp, structured, and unforgiving. I reached for a tailored emerald green suit. The fabric was rich and heavy cut, with razor-sharp lapels and a cinched waist. It was a garment designed for warfare, not for polite cocktail conversation. I paired it with a crisp ivory blouse and pointed black stiletto heels. I held the jacket up to the mirror, observing the severe lines and the imposing silhouette. Tomorrow night, my parents and my brother would gather beneath those pristine white tents. They would raise their crystal glasses and toast to their own brilliant deception. They would wait for me to shrink into the background and accept my unceremonious defeat. I carefully steamed the emerald jacket, watching the wrinkles smooth out into perfect, pristine fabric. I packed the thick ceremonial folder containing the true warranty deed, the eviction notices, and the assigned contractor debt into my sleek leather briefcase. The trap was fully constructed, polished, and primed. I turned off the bedroom lamp, plunging the apartment into darkness. The battlefield was set, and I was more than ready to step onto the grass. Saturday evening descended over the historic district, bringing a cool breeze that swept away the daytime humidity. The ancestral estate glowed like a beacon of fabricated royalty. Hundreds of warm fairy lights were meticulously strung through the sprawling branches of the heritage oak trees, casting a soft amber illumination across the manicured lawns. A professional string quartet occupied the far corner of the eastern garden, playing a delicate classical arrangement that floated above the hum of polite conversation. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Thomas and Caroline held court near the stone fountain, playing their roles with practiced, flawless grace. My father wore a bespoke tuxedo, tailored to project an aura of unshakable authority. He shook hands with local politicians and wealthy developers, laughing at jokes he did not find funny, projecting the illusion of a man who owned the world. He hid his crippling commercial debt behind a veneer of effortless charm. My mother stood by his side, draped in a flowing navy gown, her signature pearl necklace catching the amber light. She greeted the wives of country club board members with warm, superficial embraces, pretending her family was the absolute pinnacle of Southern elegance. Preston mingled near the open French doors, radiating an unearned, arrogant triumph. He wore a velvet dinner jacket and held a fresh glass of expensive wine. Victoria clung to his arm, showcasing a new diamond bracelet she undoubtedly purchased on credit, anticipating their impending windfall. They accepted early congratulations from the guests, soaking in the admiration like parched earth absorbing rain. I stepped out of my sedan and walked up the gravel driveway. The emerald green suit I selected felt like a tailored layer of armor. The sharp, structured lapels and pointed black stiletto heels announced my presence long before I spoke a single word. I did not head toward the center of the gathering. I bypassed the glowing white tents and the crowded bar, choosing a quiet, strategic position on the periphery of the veranda. I stood in the shadows, observing the glittering spectacle of their deception. Aunt Valerie materialized beside me, her footsteps silent against the stone patio. She wore a stunning plum-colored silk dress and held a solitary glass of sparkling water. She did not look at my parents or my brother. She watched the guests evaluating the crowd with the calculating gaze of a seasoned prosecutor. They invited half the city council and 3 superior court judges. Valerie murmured, her voice barely rising above the music. Thomas is determined to make this transfer as public as possible. He thinks an audience of peers will solidify the transaction and insulate him from scrutiny. He believes if enough important people witness the event, it somehow makes the lie real. He is building his own audience for the finale, I replied, keeping my tone hushed and even. It saves us the trouble of printing a press release. Valerie offered a slow, knowing smirk. She took a sip of her water, her dark eyes tracking Preston as he moved through the crowd. He is drunk on the attention, she noted. He truly thinks he earned this. The evening progressed, flowing on a river of expensive alcohol and hollow flattery. The caterers began clearing the appetizer plates, signaling the transition toward the main event. Preston checked his gold wristwatch and offered a subtle nod to our father. Thomas tapped a silver spoon against his champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the ambient noise, drawing the attention of every guest on the lawn. The string quartet faded into silence. Preston detached himself from Victoria and walked toward the grand mahogany staircase. He climbed 3 steps, elevating himself above the crowd. He stood on the very structure he secretly planned to demolish. The intricate hand-carved balustrades framing his velvet jacket. The irony tasted metallic on my tongue. He rested one hand casually on the newel post, smiling down at the sea of wealthy faces. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Preston began, his voice amplified by the natural acoustics of the grand foyer. We gathered here to celebrate more than just a new chapter for Victoria and me. We are celebrating the enduring legacy of the Richard family. This historic estate represents generations of hard work, dedication, and vision. It is a profound responsibility to accept the stewardship of such a magnificent property. He paused, scanning the crowd to ensure they were captivated by his performance. He placed a hand over his heart, a gesture of feigned humility that made my stomach churn. My father taught me that heritage is not simply inherited, it must be earned. Preston continued, weaving his web of corporate buzzwords and empty sentiment. It requires forward-thinking leadership to ensure these foundations remain strong for the next century. Victoria and I plan to honor that history while introducing a fresh, modern vision. We are ready to take on the mantle and carry our family name into a bright, prosperous future. The audience murmured in polite agreement, captivated by his confident delivery. Preston let his gaze sweep across the veranda until he found me standing in the shadows. A condescending smirk touched the corners of his mouth. He could not resist the urge to twist the knife in front of an audience. I also want to take a brief moment to thank my sister, Adelaide Preston, said his tone dripping with patronizing pity. While I am focused on the future business endeavors of this family, she has always dedicated herself to the past. Her little historical hobbies and her fondness for dusting old antiques have certainly helped keep the property looking quaint. We appreciate your quiet background efforts, Adelaide. We truly do. The guests turned their heads, searching the periphery, until they spotted me. They offered a round of polite, scattered applause. It was the kind of applause reserved for a loyal, obedient servant. My mother smiled at me from the front row, mouthing the words, "Thank you," with a terrifying artificial sweetness. They expected me to lower my head and accept the public demotion. I did not break eye contact with Preston. I stood tall in my emerald suit, keeping my expression entirely serene. I offered him a single slow nod, acknowledging his performance. Let him have his applause. Let him savor the spotlight. It was the last moment of unearned glory he would ever experience. Thomas stepped forward, joining Preston at the base of the mahogany staircase. He carried a thick, decorative leather folder embossed with the Richard family crest. The crowd hushed, sensing the climax of the evening. This was the moment of transfer, the ceremonial passing of the torch that Thomas engineered to cement his proxy scheme. As a father, there is no greater joy than seeing your son step into his rightful place, Thomas announced, his voice booming with patriarchal pride. Preston, you have proven yourself ready to lead. Caroline and I are incredibly proud to formally transfer the deed of this ancestral estate into your capable hands. Thomas opened the leather folder, revealing a thick stack of crisp legal paper. It was the fraudulent quitclaim deed he had demanded I sign days earlier, combined with his own fabricated transfer documents. He held a gold fountain pen, extending it toward Preston. The crowd leaned in, waiting for the ink to touch the page. I shifted my gaze away from my brother and looked toward the heavy oak front doors. The heavy brass handles turned clicking loudly in the quiet foyer. The doors swung open, revealing Elias Caldwell. The veteran estate attorney stepped onto the hardwood floor, his presence instantly commanding the room. He wore a dark charcoal suit that hung impeccably on his rigid frame. In his right hand, he carried a worn leather briefcase containing the true warranty deed, the eviction notices, and the assigned contractor debt. Mr. Caldwell stopped inside the entryway, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked past the bewildered guests, past my father, holding the fake documents, and past Preston standing on the stairs. He found me standing on the veranda. I held his gaze and offered a silent, confirming nod. The trap was perfectly set. The steel jaws were ready to snap shut. The flashbulbs from the hired event photographer popped in rapid succession, casting stark white shadows against the mahogany wainscoting. Thomas stood at the base of the staircase, holding the gold fountain pen out to Preston. The guests leaned in, holding their collective breath in anticipation of the historic signing. The illusion of their grand dynasty was mere seconds away from being immortalized on film. Then, a voice resonated through the grand foyer, carrying the unmistakable weight of a courtroom gavel. "Excuse the interruption," Mr. Caldwell boomed his baritone, echoing off the vaulted plaster ceiling. He did not raise his voice to an undignified shout, but the sheer authority in his tone froze the entire room. The string quartet had already stopped playing, but now even the polite murmurs and the clinking of ice in cocktail glasses ceased entirely. Thomas lowered the fountain pen, his polished smile fracturing into a rigid grimace. "Elias, what is the meaning of this?" Thomas demanded, his face flushing with sudden indignation. "This is a private family celebration. You were not invited. You are trespassing on my property." Mr. Caldwell ignored the patriarch entirely. He walked past the local politicians, the real estate developers, and the Superior Court judges. His polished leather shoes clicked methodically against the hardwood floor, creating a rhythmic countdown to their destruction. He stopped at the bottom of the staircase, looking directly up at Preston. "I am here, acting in my official capacity as the designated executor for the estate of Estelle Richard," Mr. Caldwell stated, addressing the room at large. "It is my strict fiduciary duty to inform everyone present tonight that this ceremonial transfer is void. The document you hold, Thomas, is legally worthless." Preston scoffed, gripping his crystal champagne flute tighter. He looked down at the veteran attorney with sneering contempt. "You are out of your depth, old man," Preston said, his voice dripping with unearned arrogance. "My father controls the family trust. We are signing the deed tonight, and there is nothing you can do to stop it." Mr. Caldwell unclasped his worn leather briefcase. He retrieved a thick, crisp stack of legal parchment. The top page bore the raised golden seal of the Wake County Register of Deeds, catching the light from the antique chandelier. He extended his arm, holding the certified document up toward my brother. "Read it for yourself, son," Mr. Caldwell offered his voice, dropping to a low, chilling register. Preston snatched the paper from the attorney. Thomas stepped up onto the first stair, leaning over his son's shoulder, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal paragraphs. The silence in the foyer grew so heavy it felt difficult to draw breath. I watched from the periphery of the veranda, tracking every micro-expression on my brother's face. The smug, arrogant flush of alcohol and triumph drained away in a single devastating instant, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His eyes widened, scanning the signature line, the notarized stamp, and the undeniable date recorded 6 months prior. The paper trembled in his grip. The realization crashed into him, shattering the fragile architecture of his ego. His hands shook with a sudden, uncontrollable tremor. He lost his grip on the crystal flute. The glass slipped from his fingers, falling in agonizing slow motion. It struck the hardwood floor with a sharp, deafening crack. Crystal shards exploded outward, glittering under the amber lights. Expensive vintage champagne splashed across the polished wood, soaking into the cuffs of his velvet trousers. The sound of the breaking glass was the only noise in the cavernous room. Thomas stared at the shattered crystal, his jaw slack, his breath hitching in his throat. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire empire turn to dust and blow away in the wind. The illusion of his immense wealth and untouchable status dissolved, leaving nothing but a desperate, bankrupt fraud standing on a staircase. Mr. Caldwell turned his attention back to my father, ensuring the high society guests heard every single syllable of his next sentence. Estelle Richard bypassed the family trust, Mr. Caldwell announced, his voice ringing clear and true. She executed a direct transfer of this property 6 months before her passing. Adelaide Richard has been the sole exclusive owner of this estate for half a year. Therefore, any attempt by you, Thomas, or you, Preston, to transfer, alter, demolish, or borrow against the equity of this property constitutes deliberate criminal fraud. A visceral, collective gasp rippled through the audience. The wealthy socialites covered their mouths, trading shocked, horrified whispers. The politicians took a collective step backward, distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of a financial crime. They understood the legal implications immediately. The rumor mill would spread the truth across Raleigh before midnight. Preston had just tried to collateralize a shadow loan using an asset he did not own. He was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. Victoria stood near the French doors, her designer gown suddenly looking like a prison uniform. Her eyes darted from the fake deed in Thomas' hand to the true deed shaking in Preston's grip. The terrifying reality of her situation dawned on her. She was legally bound to a man who possessed 0 assets and a mountain of fraudulent debt. I stepped out from the shadows of the veranda. My emerald green suit cut a sharp, imposing silhouette against the soft lighting of the foyer. The crowd parted for me, instinctively stepping aside to let the true owner pass. I walked across the room, the sharp click of my stiletto heels echoing over the whispered gossip. I did not rush. I took my time, claiming the space that my grandmother had entrusted to me. I stopped next to Mr. Caldwell, looking up at my father and my brother. They were frozen on the stairs, trapped in a cage of their own making. I did not feel a single ounce of anger or pity. I felt a cold, absolute clarity. The patriarchal expectation that demanded my submission was dead on the floor, lying in a puddle of spilled wine. I turned my back on them and faced the crowd of elite guests. I let my gaze sweep over the politicians, the judges, and the country club gossips. "I apologize for the dramatic interruption to your evening," I said, my voice smooth, calm, and laced with chilling authority. "There has clearly been a fundamental misunderstanding regarding the stewardship of this heritage site. But please, do not let this unfortunate clerical error ruin your night. The caterers have prepared a wonderful menu, and the string quartet will resume playing shortly." I offered the room a serene, flawless smile. "Welcome to my home." The string quartet awkwardly picked up their bows, playing a hesitant, disjointed melody. The guests stood frozen, trapped between the social obligation to stay and the desperate urge to flee a crime scene. Behind me, I heard the heavy, frantic breathing of my brother. The public humiliation was complete, but the private destruction was just beginning. Victoria turned on her heel, her face twisted in pure fury, and marched toward the library, her footsteps heavy with impending divorce. The real consequences of their greed were finally coming to collect. The polite society of Raleigh evaporated before my eyes. The moment the true ownership of the estate was exposed, the glittering illusion of the housewarming gala shattered into a million jagged pieces. The wealthy guests who had been sipping vintage champagne and offering hollow flattery just moments prior suddenly treated the grand foyer like a contaminated hazard zone. They recognized the unmistakable scent of a catastrophic financial crime. A prominent Superior Court judge was the first to move. He set his untouched cocktail on a silver tray, adjusted his tie, and walked briskly toward the heavy oak front doors without offering a single word of farewell. His abrupt departure broke the invisible spell holding the crowd hostage. The exodus began as a quiet trickle and rapidly escalated into a panicked flood. Socialites scrambled toward the valet stand, whispering frantically into their cell phones. Local politicians deleted the event from their digital calendars while walking down the gravel driveway, desperate to erase any physical or digital association with my father. The hired string quartet packed their expensive wooden instruments into velvet-lined cases, fleeing the veranda as if the canvas tents had caught fire. The catering staff vanished into the kitchen, abandoning silver trays of caviar to melt under the warm amber lighting. Within 10 minutes, the sprawling manicured lawns were entirely empty. The only remnants of the lavish celebration were discarded crystal glasses and the heavy, suffocating silence of absolute ruin. Preston remained frozen on the bottom step of the mahogany staircase. The true warranty deed hung limply in his trembling hand. He stared at the shattered champagne flute at his feet, completely paralyzed by the magnitude of his own arrogance. He had invited the most powerful people in the city to witness his coronation, and instead he had broadcasted his own impending felony to a live audience. Victoria broke his paralysis. She marched across the hardwood floor, her designer heels clicking with furious, aggressive purpose. She grabbed Preston by the lapel of his velvet dinner jacket, her manicured nails digging deeply into the expensive fabric. She did not whisper. She yanked him forward with a surprising violent strength, dragging him off the staircase and pulling him toward the East Wing library. Preston stumbled behind her, too shell-shocked to resist. Victoria shoved him through the heavy double doors and slammed them shut behind her. The thick, antique oak muffled their voices, but the raw volume of Victoria's screaming penetrated the dense wood. I stood in the center of the foyer, listening to the glorious destruction of the Golden Child. Victoria had spent her entire adult life carefully curating her social ascent. She married Preston specifically for the perceived safety of his generational wealth and the untouchable status of his surname. She tolerated his mediocrity because she believed he held the keys to an endless fortune. Now she realized the vault was completely empty, and the keys were forged. "You signed the master promissory note," Victoria shrieked, her voice vibrating through the walls. "I sat right next to you in that corner office while you signed the collateral documents. You told the private equity firm you owned this property free and clear. You swore on paper that you held the title." "I can fix it," Preston stammered, his voice pitching high with desperate panic. "The lawyers can find a loophole. My father will handle the investors. We just need to restructure the debt." "There is no debt to restructure, you absolute fool," she screamed, hurling something heavy against the library wall. A framed painting crashed to the floor inside the room. "You committed federal wire fraud. You pledged an asset you do not possess to secure a shadow loan. The lenders will demand the cash by Monday morning, and when the money is gone, they will send the Federal Bureau of Investigation to our front door. I will not go to federal prison because you were too arrogant to verify a county deed. The library doors burst open. Victoria stormed back into the grand foyer, her face flushed a furious mottled red. She ignored my father. She ignored me. She marched straight toward the front entrance, her designer gown whipping around her ankles. "I am calling my divorce attorney from the car," Victoria announced, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Do not call my phone, Preston. Do not return to the apartment. I am leaving your belongings in a trash bag on the curb. You are completely on your own." She slammed the heavy oak doors behind her, severing her ties to the sinking ship. Preston stumbled out of the library a few seconds later. He looked hollowed out, stripped of his wife, his fake inheritance, and his unearned pride. He stood in the hallway, utterly isolated, holding the useless legal documents against his chest like a shield that could no longer protect him. My mother could not process the rapid disintegration of her perfect reality. Caroline stood near the antique credenza, watching her wealthy friends abandon her and her daughter-in-law, flee the premises. The psychological break was sudden and terrifying. Her entire identity relied on the admiration of her peers and the submission of her daughter. With her audience gone and her manipulation rendered useless, she reverted to her most primal instinct. Caroline locked her furious eyes onto me. Her polished veneer of southern grace vanished, replaced by raw, venomous hatred. She charged across the foyer, raising her right hand, her palm open and her fingers rigid. She intended to strike me across the face, to physically punish me for destroying her grand illusion. I did not flinch. I did not step back to avoid the blow. Before her hand could connect, Aunt Valerie materialized from the periphery. Valerie moved with a fluid, terrifying speed. She reached out and caught my mother's wrist, suspended in midair. The impact created a sharp slapping sound. Valerie gripped Caroline's forearm so tightly, her knuckles turned a stark bone white. "Let go of me," Caroline hissed, struggling against the iron grip. She ruined everything. She destroyed this family out of pure spite. Valerie pushed Caroline's arm down, forcing her to lower her hand. Valerie stepped directly into my mother's personal space, towering over her with an intimidating, majestic authority. "You destroyed this family the moment you decided your daughter was nothing more than a stepping stone for your incompetent son." Valerie delivered the reprimand in a low, lethal whisper. "You spent 30 years pretending to be an aristocrat, Caroline. You wore the pearls and hosted the galas, acting superior to everyone who married into this toxic bloodline. But a true lady does not attempt to strike her own child in the foyer like a common street brawler. You possess absolutely no grace. You are nothing but a desperate, bankrupt fraud, playing dress-up in a house you do not even own." Caroline shrank backward, the cruel truth piercing her fragile ego. She pulled her wrist free, cradling her arm against her chest. The fight drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow, shivering shell of a woman. She looked around the empty foyer, realizing she had no power, no allies, and no audience left to manipulate. Thomas had remained entirely silent during the chaos. The patriarch of the Richard family stood near the stone fireplace, his bespoke tuxedo suddenly looking 2 sizes too large for his deflating frame. He stared blankly at the shattered crystal on the floor. He was performing a silent, devastating arithmetic in his mind. The shadow loan was intended to bail out his failing commercial real estate ventures. Without the equity of the Craftsman estate to secure the private funding, the massive influx of cash he promised his creditors would never arrive. By Monday morning, his private lenders would initiate foreclosure proceedings on his luxury strip malls. His country club memberships would be revoked. His personal bank accounts would be frozen. The financial ruin he spent 5 years hiding in the shadows was about to be dragged into the glaring light of public bankruptcy. Thomas staggered backward, his knees buckling under the crushing weight of his exposure. He collapsed heavily into an antique wingback chair, burying his face in his hands. A low, pathetic sob escaped his lips. The undisputed king of the historic district was reduced to a weeping, terrified old man. The grand foyer grew eerily quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of the refrigerator in the catering kitchen and the shallow, ragged breathing of my defeated relatives. I stood tall in the center of the wreckage. My emerald suit remained perfectly crisp, unwrinkled by the emotional warfare. I surveyed the damage, looking at my sobbing father, my trembling mother, and my isolated, broken brother. They had tried to erase my history to fund their greed. They had demanded my submission under the guise of family loyalty. Now they had absolutely nothing. I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket, checking the digital clock on the screen. It was exactly 10:15 in the evening. I slid the phone back into my pocket and clasped my hands together. "The party is officially over," I stated, my voice cutting through the silence with calm, absolute authority. "You have 30 minutes to collect your personal belongings from the coat room and vacate the premises. If any of you are still standing on this property when the clock strikes 11, I will call the county sheriff and have you forcibly removed for criminal trespassing." I turned my back on them and walked toward the grand mahogany staircase, the sharp rhythm of my heels signaling the end of their reign. Monday morning brought a crisp, biting chill to the Raleigh Historic District. The weekend chaos had mutated into a toxic, swirling rumor mill. By 9 o'clock, my office phone at the Historic Preservation Commission rang without pause. The calls were not from concerned contractors or local architects. They were inquiries from local journalists and society bloggers. My parents were refusing to retreat into the shadows. Instead, they launched a desperate, vicious smear campaign across the local high society circuit, attempting to rewrite the narrative of their humiliating defeat. Caroline and Thomas spent their Sunday making frantic, tearful phone calls to every influential family in the county. They painted a horrific, fabricated picture. They claimed I was a manipulative, cold-blooded thief who took advantage of a frail, dying woman. My mother told the president of the Heritage Society that I had coerced Grandmother Estelle on her deathbed, isolating her from the rest of the family to steal the ancestral estate. It was a calculated assassination of my character, designed to destroy the one thing I valued most, my professional integrity. At 10:15, my cell phone buzzed. A text message from Thomas glowed on the screen. The words were terse and laced with pure venom. "The Raleigh Observer is running a front-page story on Thursday," Thomas wrote. "They are going to expose your elder abuse. Resign your position, hand over the deed to your brother, and we will tell the reporters it was a misunderstanding. If you fight us, your career in this state is over." He was attempting to hold my livelihood hostage. A senior architectural historian could not possess a tainted public record. The commission relied on public trust and ethical transparency. A scandal involving the coercion of an elderly relative to secure a historic property would force my immediate resignation. Thomas believed he had found my Achilles heel. He severely underestimated the meticulous paranoia of Elias Caldwell and the brilliant foresight of my late grandmother. Estelle knew her son possessed a treacherous heart. She anticipated he would challenge her mental competence the moment the true warranty deed surfaced. I did not reply to his extortion attempt. I picked up my desk phone and contacted the administrative assistant for the Commission Board of Directors. I requested an emergency closed-door meeting with the department head and the city manager. I gathered my sleek leather briefcase and walked down the marble hallway toward the executive conference room. The city manager sat at the head of the long, polished table, looking grim. The head of the preservation board sat beside him, arms crossed, waiting for an explanation regarding the sudden media inquiries. They valued my expertise, but municipal optics governed their decisions. "Good morning, gentlemen," I began, my tone projecting calm, unwavering confidence. "I am aware of the defamatory rumors currently circulating through the local press regarding my recent inheritance. My estranged family is attempting to weaponize this municipal office to extort a private property transfer. I am here to provide you with the empirical, unassailable facts. I opened my briefcase and distributed 3 thick bound folders. The city manager opened the cover, his eyes scanning the first page. Those are the sworn affidavits and medical evaluations secured on the exact day my grandmother transferred the deed, I explained, pacing slowly across the thick carpet. 6 months ago, my attorney hired an independent board-certified forensic psychiatrist to evaluate Estelle Richard. Turn to page 4. You will find a comprehensive cognitive assessment proving she possessed a flawless, lucid understanding of her actions. She scored in the 99th percentile for mental acuity. The department head flipped through the pages, his grim expression softening into profound relief. Furthermore, I continued pointing to a silver flash drive tucked into the front pocket of their folders. That drive contains a time-stamped high-definition video deposition. My grandmother details her explicit intention to bypass her son due to his reckless financial behavior. She states clearly and unequivocally that she is acting of her own free will without any external pressure. Any journalist who attempts to publish my father-fabricated narrative will face an immediate catastrophic defamation lawsuit. I have already forwarded these identical files to the legal department of the Raleigh Observer. The story is dead. The city manager closed his folder, offering a firm, approving nod. He understood the situation perfectly. The commission was shielded from liability, and my professional standing remained pristine. The blackmail attempt evaporated into thin air. I returned to my office, sitting down at my desk. My parents had tried to destroy my career. It was time to return the favor and sever their final remaining lifeline. Their entire existence revolved around the Oakmont Country Club. The sprawling golf courses and exclusive dining rooms provided the crucial stage where Thomas brokered his deals and Caroline reigned over local gossip. Membership was their ultimate currency. I opened my personal laptop, bypassing the municipal network. I accessed the encrypted flash drive Aunt Valerie had given me at the Asheville Bistro. The ledger contained the devastating truth of my father's secret commercial real estate defaults and the specific details of Preston fraudulent loan applications. I compiled the financial records into a single, undeniable digital dossier. I drafted a brief, anonymous email addressed directly to the Oakmont Country Club Ethics Committee and the Board of Directors. The Oakmont Charter contained a strict morality clause. The club existed to shield the elite from scandal, and they ruthlessly expelled any member who brought financial disgrace or criminal liability to their pristine reputation. I attached the bankruptcy notices, the outstanding mechanic lien, and the proof of the shadow loan fraud. I clicked Send. The digital payload launched across the city, guaranteeing a swift and brutal social retaliation. Tuesday afternoon arrived with a gentle southern breeze, but a hurricane was tearing through the Oakmont dining room. I learned the details later that evening through a highly satisfied phone call from Aunt Valerie. Thomas and Caroline had arrived at the club for their customary Tuesday lunch. They were desperate to project an image of calm stability, trying to socialize with their wealthy peers, as if the weekend disaster had never occurred. They sat at their usual corner table, overlooking the 18th hole, sipping iced tea and waiting for their salads. The club president approached their table, accompanied by 2 members of the ethics committee and a private security guard. The president did not sit down. He did not offer a warm handshake or a polite greeting. He stood over my father, holding a plain white envelope. Thomas, the president said, his voice clipped and devoid of any prior friendship. The board has reviewed your recent financial disclosures. We are also aware of the pending federal investigations regarding your son and the alleged loan fraud tied to your commercial debts. Oakmont cannot associate with this level of explicit financial misconduct. Caroline dropped her linen napkin, her face draining of all color. She looked around the dining room. Dozens of wealthy patrons were staring at them, their eyes filled with cold judgment. The social exile was unfolding in real time. We are asking for your immediate resignation, the president continued, sliding the white envelope onto the table. It contained a prorated refund of their annual dues. If you refuse to resign, we will initiate a formal expulsion vote this evening. Please collect your belongings and exit the premises quietly. Your accounts are permanently closed." Thomas did not argue. The undeniable proof had stripped him of his arrogance and his false nobility. He picked up the envelope, his hands trembling with profound humiliation. He stood up, helping my mother out of her chair. They walked out of the dining room, flanked by the security guard, passing tables of former friends who suddenly found their salads intensely interesting, refusing to make eye contact. The attempt to destroy my professional life had rebounded with lethal precision. My career remained an untouchable fortress, while their reputations were reduced to scattered ash. They were entirely isolated from the elite community they had spent decades trying to impress. The heavy iron gates of Oakmont swung shut behind them, locking them out in the cold. Their social currency was bankrupt. Yet, the true legal reckoning was still looming on the horizon, because Preston was about to discover that federal lenders did not offer polite requests for resignation. They sent agents with badges. The gears of institutional finance grind slow, but they grind fine. The private equity firm located in the sleek glass towers of downtown Raleigh employed a team of ruthless risk analysts. Their entire business model relied on securing high-interest loans with ironclad collateral. On Wednesday afternoon, a junior analyst ran a routine secondary title verification on the shadow loan Preston had signed. The county database returned a conflicting owner name. It did not display the Richard Family Trust. It displayed my name. The firm realized their millions were secured by nothing but a fabricated signature and an inflated ego. They did not call my brother to ask for a polite explanation. They did not send a warning letter. They called the federal authorities. Financial institutions despise being made to look foolish, and they punish deception with swift, bureaucratic precision. Thursday morning arrived with a cold, gray drizzle that soaked the city streets. Preston was hiding in a furnished short-term rental on the outer edge of the business district. Victoria had frozen their joint accounts and changed the locks on their luxury penthouse. My brother was sleeping on a cheap synthetic mattress, surrounded by unpacked cardboard boxes and the lingering smell of stale takeout food. At 6 a.m, a sharp, rhythmic knock echoed through his thin apartment door. He opened it to find 3 agents wearing dark windbreakers bearing federal insignias. White-collar raids do not feature shouting or drawn weapons. They are quiet, clinical, and terrifyingly polite. The lead agent stepped inside holding a thick manila folder. They directed Preston to sit down at a flimsy glass dining table in the center of the sterile room. They laid out the master promissory note he signed just days earlier. They placed the fraudulent quitclaim deed next to it. They explained the severe federal penalties for securing interstate funds under false pretenses. The stark reality of a federal indictment crashed over him in freezing waves. His inherited arrogance dissolved into pure, unfiltered panic. The charming facade he used to navigate country clubs and zoning boards proved entirely useless against federal investigators. A cornered rat will bite anything to survive. Preston looked at the agents and made a choice that permanently fractured our family tree. He did not ask for a lawyer. He opened his mouth and shifted the blame entirely onto the patriarch who had shielded him his entire life. My father orchestrated the entire transfer. Preston stammered, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. His hands shook, rattling the flimsy glass table. Thomas told me the title was clear. He drafted the paperwork and hired the appraiser. He needed the cash to save his commercial strip malls from foreclosure. I was just following his instructions. I did not know the deed was fake. The golden child traded his father for the desperate hope of a plea deal. The unbreakable bond of patriarchal loyalty disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Preston offered up Thomas on a silver platter, hoping the investigators would view him as a naive pawn rather than a willing co-conspirator. He threw away his family name to save his own skin. 2 hours later, my office phone rang at the Historic Preservation Commission. A federal agent requested my presence at their downtown field office. I did not feel a spike of anxiety or dread. I gathered my sleek leather briefcase and walked the 4 blocks to the federal building. The air felt crisp and clean, washing away the humidity of the previous week. The interrogation room was sterile, painted in pale institutional beige that drained the warmth from the air. A stainless steel table sat in the center, bolted to the linoleum floor. I sat across from the lead investigator, folding my hands on the cool metal surface. He wore a crisp white shirt and a neutral expression designed to reveal nothing. The agent asked me to clarify the exact timeline of the estate ownership. He wanted to understand how my brother managed to convince a prominent lending firm he owned a heritage property. I opened my briefcase. I did not offer emotional narratives or complain about sibling rivalry. I did not mention my mother cruel manipulations or my father arrogant ultimatums. As a preservationist, my entire career revolved around documenting the truth and protecting structural foundations from decay. I treated this federal inquiry the exact same way I treated a historical audit. I handed the agent a certified chronological log of the true deed transfer, signed by Elias Caldwell 6 months prior. I provided the official municipal stop work order I issued during the unpermitted porch demolition. This specific document proved Preston knew his authority over the estate was legally contested long before he signed the shadow loan. He could not claim ignorance. Then I handed over a secure digital storage drive. When Preston brought those unlicensed contractors to my home, I recognized the immediate physical threat to the property. I had ordered the quiet installation of motion-activated security cameras hidden deep within the branches of the heritage oak trees. The drive contained high-definition footage of Preston directing the illegal demolition. More importantly, the audio captured him bragging to the foreman about securing the private equity funds to finance his modern renovations. The investigator reviewed the documents, sliding them carefully into evidence folders. He plugged the drive into his secure laptop and watched the footage of my brother destroying the historic balustrade. The agent looked up at me, offering a small, firm nod of genuine professional respect. My meticulous record-keeping provided the exact forensic evidence required to seal the indictment. There were no loose ends and no plausible deniability left for my brother or my father. Their empire of lies was built on a foundation of sand and illusions. I had simply brought the incoming tide of facts. The overarching theme of my life work seamlessly merged with my pursuit of justice. Preserving the truth always outlasts those who attempt to destroy it. I walked out of the federal building into the bright afternoon sunlight. The legal machinery was now churning at full speed, preparing the arrest warrants. However, Preston was not quite ready to surrender his final delusion of grandeur. His short-term rental agreement required a daily credit card authorization. When the charge declined due to his frozen bank accounts, the landlord remotely disabled the electronic door locks. Homeless, facing federal wire fraud charges, and abandoned by his furious wife, Preston retreated to the only place he felt a lingering sense of unearned entitlement. He drove his leased luxury sedan back to the ancestral estate. He bypassed the main house and broke into the small historic guest cottage situated on the far western edge of the property. He barricaded himself inside, squatting on the land he once believed he would rule. He thought he could hide from the consequences of his actions by retreating to the shadows of our family history. He was sorely mistaken. The final eviction was drawing near, and I intended to supervise his departure personally. Preston refused to accept his defeat gracefully. When his short-term rental landlord disabled the electronic locks due to insufficient funds, my brother found himself locked out of his temporary sanctuary. Homeless, facing federal wire fraud charges, and abandoned by his furious wife, he retreated to the only place he felt a lingering sense of unearned entitlement. He drove his leased luxury sedan back to the ancestral estate under the cover of darkness. He bypassed the main house and broke into the historic guest cottage situated on the far western edge of the property. The structure was an original 1920s carriage house that once sheltered my grandfather's vintage motor cars. It featured pristine beadboard ceilings and sliding barn doors. Now it housed a desperate fugitive. Preston barricaded himself inside the small dwelling. He pulled down the heavy linen shades and locked the deadbolts. He refused to answer his cell phone or respond to emails. He clung to a pathetic delusion, believing that if he simply remained physically planted on Richard family soil, the authorities and the creditors could not touch him. He thought his physical presence would somehow override my legal ownership. I discovered his forced entry the following morning, when I found his sedan parked haphazardly on the rear service lawn. I did not march across the grass to confront him. I did not pound on the carriage house door or engage in an emotional screaming match. As a senior architectural historian, I respected the formal process of documentation and the undeniable power of paper trails. I drove downtown and hired a licensed process server. I filed a formal 30-day eviction notice through the county court system. I returned to the estate and watched from the veranda as the server taped the stark white legal document to the carriage house door. The clock began ticking loud and unforgiving. I did not interact with Preston for an entire month. I went to my office at the commission. I drank chamomile tea on the pristine wraparound porch. I let the slow, unstoppable machinery of the legal system do the heavy lifting. Preston spent those 30 days trapped inside a dark cottage, watching his luxury lifestyle evaporate, waiting for a parental rescue that was never going to arrive. Day 30 dawned crisp and biting. The morning air carried a sharp chill signaling the imminent arrival of a harsh winter. I stood at the end of the oak-lined street, waiting for my requested escort. 2 deputies from the Wake County Sheriff Department arrived exactly at 8 o'clock. They drove a standard black and white cruiser, pulling to a stop near the wrought iron gates. Their uniforms were neat and their expressions were stern. They understood the assignment perfectly. We were executing a court-ordered mandate to remove a hostile trespasser from private property. We walked up the long gravel driveway together. The scene presented a stark, poetic contrast to the lavish Sunday dinner that started this bitter war. There were no crystal wine goblets or silver platters of roasted pheasant today. There were no white catering tents or professional string quartets. There was only the harsh, undeniable reality of law enforcement boots crunching against the stone path. We reached the carriage house. The lead deputy stepped onto the small wooden porch and pounded his heavy fist against the door. The sound echoed across the quiet morning lawn, sharp and commanding. Preston Richard, the deputy, called out his voice carrying clear legal authority. "This is the Wake County Sheriff Department. You are hereby ordered to vacate these premises immediately, pursuant to a lawful eviction decree. Open the door or we will breach the lock." A long, tense silence followed. For a moment, I wondered if my brother had slipped away during the night. Then the deadbolt clicked. The heavy door swung inward a few inches. The golden child was entirely unrecognizable. His expensive designer haircut was a disheveled, greasy mess. He wore wrinkled sweatpants and a stained gray undershirt. A foul odor wafted from the dark interior of the cottage, a mixture of stale beer, unwashed laundry, and sheer panic. He looked past the deputies and locked his bloodshot eyes onto me. He expected me to show mercy. He expected the sister, who used to shrink down and step aside, to suddenly fold under the weight of family loyalty. I offered him a flat, unblinking stare, holding my ground. "You have 10 minutes to collect your personal effects," the deputy stated, stepping inside the historic structure and forcing Preston to retreat. "Anything left behind will be considered abandoned property." Preston stumbled backward into the dim room. He reached for a stack of expensive leather suitcases resting in the corner, but the second deputy shook his head. Victoria had purchased those suitcases during their honeymoon, and she reported them stolen during their messy separation proceedings. The deputy reached into his tactical belt and handed Preston a roll of heavy-duty black plastic contractor bags. The symbolism was profound and devastating. My brother scrambled around the room, stuffing his wrinkled clothes, his expensive shoes, and his cheap plastic toothbrush into the trash bags. He looked like a common vagrant packing up a temporary camp. The illusion of his immense wealth and untouchable status was stripped away, leaving nothing but a desperate man shoving dirty laundry into garbage plastic. I stood on the porch watching him pack his ruined life. Through the bare branches of the heritage oak trees, I saw a vehicle park down the street near the edge of the property line. It was not the luxury European sedan my father used to drive. It was a mid-sized domestic rental car. Thomas and Caroline stepped out onto the concrete sidewalk. They looked smaller today, diminished by their public bankruptcy and their rapid social exile. They desperately wanted to march up the driveway and intervene. They wanted to shield their favored son from the harsh consequences of his actions. But they could not cross the threshold. Following the disastrous housewarming gala, I filed a comprehensive protective order. My mother attempted a physical assault in the foyer, and my father sent explicit extortion threats via text message, attempting to blackmail a municipal official. The presiding Superior Court judge granted the injunction without a single hesitation. The legal boundary mandated my parents remain 500 feet away from my person and my property. Thomas stood on the public sidewalk, his toes resting an inch away from the invisible line he dared not cross. He knew an arrest for violating a restraining order would ruin his pending commercial bankruptcy negotiations. Preston finished filling 3 heavy black bags. He slung them over his shoulder, groaning under the weight. The deputies escorted him out of the carriage house and guided him down the long gravel driveway. I walked behind them, ensuring the procession maintained a steady, deliberate pace. Preston dragged his feet, the plastic bags scraping harshly against the sharp driveway stones. He walked toward the wrought iron gates, toward the parents who had enabled his immense arrogance since childhood. Thomas and Caroline stood on the public curb waiting to receive their exiled heir. Caroline pressed a crumpled tissue to her face, weeping quietly. Her signature pearl necklace was missing, likely sold to pay for retaining a defense attorney. Thomas kept his hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring at the asphalt. There were no proud declarations of legacy today. There were no promises of a bright corporate future or toasts to a new patriarch. They watched their son stumble across the property line, clutching garbage bags. He crossed from my sanctuary onto the public street. The deputies tipped their hats to me and returned to their cruiser, their official duties fulfilled. I stepped up to the grand wrought iron gates. The heavy metal bars were forged a century ago, designed specifically to protect the heritage within. I grabbed the cold iron handles and pulled them together. The gates swung shut with a solid, definitive clang that echoed down the quiet street. I pulled a thick brass padlock from my tailored jacket pocket. I threaded the heavy metal loop through the iron chains and snapped it shut. The locking mechanism clicked, echoing like a final gavel strike, ending a long, bitter war. The patriarchal expectation was entirely subverted. The men who believed they ruled the world by birthright were now standing on the wrong side of a locked gate, shivering in the cold morning air. I stood on the inside, the undisputed guardian of the foundation. I did not say a single word to them. The legal reality spoke loud enough. I turned my back on my former family and walked toward the main house, setting the stage for the final, enduring restoration. Spring arrived in Raleigh, painting the oak-lined streets in vibrant shades of emerald. Sunlight filtered through the original leaded glass windows of the Craftsman estate, casting prismatic reflections across the pristine hardwood floors. I walked down the central corridor, listening to the quiet, steady rhythm of my own footsteps. For the first time in my life, the heavy, suffocating tension that once infected these walls had evaporated. It was replaced by a profound, breathing stillness. I ran my hand along the original pocket doors, feeling the solid weight of the old-growth timber. The house felt alive again, purged of the toxic patriarchal expectations that had choked it for decades. The structure was breathing, settling into a new era of genuine peace. 7 months had passed since the crisp morning I locked the wrought iron gates. The wheels of federal justice turned with slow, methodical precision, grinding down the illusions of arrogant men. Preston resided in a sterile federal holding facility, awaiting a highly publicized trial for interstate wire fraud and bank deception. His luxury-leased sedan had been repossessed by the dealership, and his bespoke velvet dinner jackets were replaced by standard-issue institutional clothing. He faced a mandatory minimum sentence that no amount of country club networking could erase. Victoria had finalized a ruthless divorce, ensuring she extracted every hidden asset he possessed before fleeing to a different state, leaving him entirely isolated. He sat in a concrete cell, stripped of his unearned pride, facing the cold reality of a ruined future. Thomas and Caroline were exiled to a modest 2-bedroom condominium in a neighboring county far away from the elite zip codes they once ruled. The private equity lenders had foreclosed on my father's failing commercial strip malls, wiping out his fabricated real estate empire in a matter of weeks. Their remaining generational wealth dissolved into thin air, consumed by aggressive defense attorneys, federal fines, and crippling court fees. They spent their days in stark social isolation, banished from the country clubs and high society galas they had worshipped. They lived entirely on a fixed retirement stipend, forced to budget their grocery bills and drive a used compact car. The illusion of their superiority was buried under a mountain of public bankruptcy filings. They traded a priceless ancestral legacy for a cheap, failed proxy scheme, and the market had corrected their error without mercy. I stepped into the East Wing Library, the specific room Preston had intended to gut to accommodate his ridiculous home gym. The antique reading tables remained untouched, polished to a rich, warm shine that caught the afternoon light. Resting on the center table was a crisp, thick-bound legal folio. It contained the crowning achievement of my professional and personal life. Working alongside Elias Caldwell and Director Evelyn Thorne from the State Auditing Board, I had officially secured a permanent heritage easement for the entire estate. This was not a temporary municipal designation. It was a binding, unbreakable covenant attached directly to the property deed recorded in the highest state archives. The easement guaranteed that the structural footprint, the historic facade, the custom millwork, and the interior architectural integrity were protected in perpetuity. No future commercial developer, no zoning loophole, and no entitled family member could ever alter the foundation. The protection extended beyond my own lifetime, legally shielding my grandmother, beloved sanctuary, forever. If anyone ever attempted to strike a wall with a sledgehammer, the state would intervene with immediate, severe legal force. The Craftsman was no longer just a private residence, vulnerable to the whims of greedy heirs. It was a permanent, untouchable monument to genuine North Carolina history anchored into the bedrock of the law. A sharp rhythmic tapping echoed from the front yard, drawing my attention away from the legal folio. The only remaining physical scar from the bitter war was the shattered balustrade on the wraparound porch, the damage inflicted by the unlicensed crew Preston had hired. I walked out the heavy oak front doors into the crisp morning air. A team of master restoration artisans from a specialized preservation guild occupied the steps. They did not use modern power tools or cheap synthetic composites. They worked with deliberate, quiet expertise, measuring and cutting raw Honduran mahogany to match the exact 1912 specifications. I stood beside the lead artisan, a man with decades of experience restoring heritage properties, examining the intricate spindlework. He handed me a smooth, hand-carved wooden peg. We did not use modern metal fasteners, staying true to the historic construction methods my grandfather had demanded. I aligned the fresh timber, pressing the wooden peg into the joint. I felt the satisfying, solid friction as the wood locked together, seamless and incredibly strong. The scent of raw timber, sawdust, and natural linseed oil filled the air, erasing the foul memory of my brother's destructive arrogance. The porch was healing. The shattered splinters were replaced by sturdy, flawless craftsmanship that would last another 100 years. By mid-afternoon, a familiar silver car pulled into the gravel driveway. Aunt Valerie stepped out carrying a small wrapped box of pastries from an artisanal bakery in Asheville. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, her posture radiating that same intimidating, majestic grace that had stopped my mother in her tracks. We sat together on the newly restored porch, the fresh mahogany gleaming under the warm southern sun. I poured 2 cups of Earl Grey tea into delicate china saucers, the fragrant steam rising into the cool air. Valerie took a slow sip, looking out over the manicured lawns and the quiet oak-lined street. It is remarkably peaceful without all the grand illusions taking up oxygen. Valerie observed her dark eyes resting on the solid iron gates. Thomas and Caroline spent their entire lives treating this property like a theatrical stage prop. They thought True Legacy was just a name, printed on a country club roster, or an invitation to a gala. They never understood that true heritage requires actual work, respect, and sacrifice to maintain. They valued the appearance of the foundation, not the foundation itself, I replied, tracing the gold rim of my teacup. They expected me to step aside because they thought I was weak. They mistook my quiet respect for history as a lack of personal ambition. They assumed I would just shrink down and let Preston tear everything apart. Valerie offered a warm, genuine smile, setting her teacup down on the small wicker table. You possess more steel in your spine than all the men in this family combined, Adelaide. You did not just save a beautiful building from ruin. You broke a toxic cycle that has haunted this bloodline for generations. We finished our tea in comfortable, companionable silence, listening to the gentle rustle of the oak leaves. When Valerie departed, I carried the antique china back into the kitchen, listening to the low hum of the estate settling into the evening. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the grand foyer. I walked to the base of the mahogany staircase, holding a heavy, ornate wooden frame. Inside the frame was an original oil portrait of Grandmother Estelle. She wore her signature tweed suit, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp and uncompromising. I climbed the first 3 steps, the exact spot where Preston had stood to deliver his arrogant, fabricated speech. I carefully mounted the heavy frame onto the wainscoted wall, right at the center of the foyer, where she could oversee everyone who crossed the threshold. I stepped back, examining the placement. The portrait hung perfectly straight, anchored deep into the original plaster. The toxic pretension was gone. The patriarchal control was broken, swept away by the undeniable force of the truth. My sanctuary was safe. My career was unassailable, and the true Richard family legacy was finally, permanently secure. There is a peculiar, quiet tragedy woven into the fabric of the traditional American dream, one that frequently hides behind the pristine facades of heritage estates and oak-lined neighborhoods. We are culturally conditioned to revere generational wealth, assuming that families who pass down century-old homes and thick trust funds are also passing down wisdom, stability, and grace. Yet, as the story of a daughter reclaiming her grandmother's estate from the hollow grip of her own parents illustrates, the most profound inheritance a child receives is never monetary. It is structural. It is the moral and emotional architecture constructed by those who raise them. When we reflect on the spectacular collapse of the Richard family, it is easy to view the parents simply as architects of their own financial ruin. But their true failure runs much deeper, striking at the very core of family responsibility and long-term parental guidance. The tragedy of this family was not born on the day the father's commercial real estate ventures failed, nor did it begin when the son forged his name on a fraudulent loan document. The collapse began decades earlier, rooted in a toxic, quiet bigotry that poisoned their parenting values. the blind patriarchal expectation that gender dictates competence and that bloodline entitles a child to a crown they have not earned. In traditional family structures, there is often an insidious temptation to mold children into preconceived roles rather than raising the individuals they actually are. The parents in our narrative fell into this generational trap. They designated their son as the golden child, grooming him to be the patriarch simply because he was the male heir. In doing so, they committed a catastrophic disservice, not just to their marginalized daughter, but to the son they claimed to favor. By shielding him from consequence, smoothing his path with nepotism, and demanding his sister sacrifice her own ambitions to cushion his ego, they did not build a strong man. They engineered a fragile, entitled shell. They robbed him of the opportunity to develop genuine resilience, accountability, and grit. When parents hand a child unearned power without demanding the corresponding character to wield it, they are not setting that child up for success. They are handing them a loaded weapon and waiting for the inevitable misfire. The son's ultimate descent into financial crime was merely the final symptom of a lifelong disease. He had been taught that the rules did not apply to him, that his surname was a shield against reality. Conversely, the daughter was subjected to a chilling lack of emotional awareness from the people who were supposed to nurture her. She was expected to shrink herself, to view her own prestigious career as a quaint hobby, and to quietly finance her brother's unearned ascension. This dynamic exposes a severe deficit in fairness and honesty, the twin pillars of healthy family responsibility. A home devoid of emotional awareness, where a child's true worth is repeatedly ignored to uphold a fabricated social image, is not a sanctuary. It is a beautifully decorated cage. The parents were so blinded by their obsession with country club prestige and the outward appearance of success that they lost the ability to see the fierce, brilliant woman they had raised. This brings us to a profound, perhaps uncomfortable realization about the nature of family loyalty in modern American culture. We are conventionally taught that loyalty means silent endurance. Society whispers that protecting the family name requires covering up mistakes, swallowing our pride, and keeping the peace at all costs. We are told that blood is an unbreakable bond that demands our complicity even when the foundation of the family is rotting from the inside out. But what if conventional wisdom is entirely wrong? What if the most profound act of family loyalty is not preservation, but destruction? When a family structure is built on a foundation of lies, financial exploitation, and toxic favoritism, stepping aside to let it continue is not an act of love. It is an act of enabling. The daughter in this narrative did not destroy her family. She simply refused to continue propping up their delusions. By allowing her brother to face the federal consequences of his fraud, and by forcing her parents to confront the reality of their bankruptcy and social exile, she delivered the only honest guidance they had ever received. True fairness sometimes requires us to let the people we love fall into the very traps they set for others. It is a harsh, agonizing form of emotional awareness, recognizing that letting a fraudulent system collapse is the highest, purest form of moral preservation. Raising children requires a dedication to the truth that transcends our own egos. It demands that we celebrate competence over tradition and character over conformity. If we want to guide the next generation toward a meaningful future, we must stop equipping them with empty titles and start equipping them with the resilience to face their own failures. We must teach them that true heritage is not the wood and stone of an ancestral house, but the quiet, unshakable integrity required to keep that house standing when the storms arrive. If this reflection resonates with the foundations you are trying to build, or the toxic structures you are fighting to dismantle in your own life, I invite you to join our growing community. Follow Mourning Revenge for more narratives that strip away the polite facades of society to reveal the unvarnished truth underneath. We explore the complex, often messy reality of reclaiming your worth in a world that asks you to remain small. In the end, we are all architects of our own lives, standing in the foyers of the futures we have built. When the applause fades, when the socialites depart, and when the bank accounts are frozen, the only thing left holding up the roof is the truth of who we are. In the dark, you must ask yourself, when the heavy doors of your own life swing shut, are you standing on a foundation of solid stone? Or are you just guarding a beautiful room full of ghosts?